All right, everybody. Welcome to Drew's Virtual Happy Hour. I, of course, am your host, Drew. Work with JVS Imports out in Sacramento, and basically what I did was I set up these virtual happy hours to give people just a little bit of a break from all the horrible nonsense that we're currently living through. And while we're taking a break, hopefully learn a couple of things. So tonight's guest is the Vice President of ImpEx with a capital E. He is the division manager for JVS Imports. He was the inaugural voice of whiskey, according to LA Magazine. He is the whiskey redhead, the mouth of the South. It is our guest tonight, Chris Uhde. Chris, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hi, everyone. Does everyone have their whiskey and beer?
Yeah, so I did 2 cocktails tonight because I knew this was going to be a long one. Or I was just going to be driven to the glass, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, and just so everybody knows, I spend most of the day kind of doing research on people and kind of pull out the things I think are interesting and stuff like that. And sometimes I read a lot of articles, so I don't want to ask some of the same questions, and they could be kind of obvious questions. So if there's anything that you're thinking of while we're doing this, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can just get it into the chat, and we might not answer it right away, but I promise you we always get to all of the questions. So if there's anything that pops up or you want some elaboration, just put that in the chat and then go from there. So with that said, I wanted to start it off with the very beginning of your career, Chris, and I think it's really interesting if you take a look at the first event that you ever did was really a point in time where your career could have gone one of two ways, an utter disaster or just a slight disaster that it is now. And so with that being the case, I was hoping that you could talk about what the story of your first tasting and how the whiskey writer Michael Jackson saved you in that scenario.
Oh, so it's 2007, and so there was a guy named Scotland. Yeah, Kaito's gonna chime in as well. There was a guy named Scotland who had gotten me my job with Sam. Oh, that's good, Kaito. You enjoying the spaghetti, buddy? Here, let me show you guys how we live out here. Everyone's getting spaghetti.
Nice.
The king. Say hi, Kaito. Anyway, so 2007, Scotland had just got me the job with Sam, and that's how I met Sam. Was he came in to sell Scotland some booze at Vendome, and we all got chatting then. And so we were trying to move. It was a Gordon MacPhail tasting, and Michael Urquhart from Gordon MacPhail was supposed to come out and do this tasting in California, and we sold it out at 65 people and took over this whole restaurant. It was a very, very big deal. I think I had been on the job for maybe 2 months. And Scotland had pulled out all the tricks to be able to get people to come to it. And we were really hoping to move some bottles. And last minute, Michael couldn't come. And so they sent out, I forget who it was, but they sent out someone from another state to kind of fill in for him. But while the guy who they sent knew a whole bunch about whiskey, he was not very good at talking to people. And especially when he saw a room full of people he didn't know, he kind of froze up and just didn't say. It kind of started to go south. And at the time, JVS had a guy working for them who was their California statewide sales manager. And he stood up to kind of start to talk to people about whiskey. And he could kind of talk to folks, but he didn't know anything about whiskey. So there's no point in that, because the guy next to you at the table could give you his opinion on what the whiskey is. So he gave some tasting notes and this, that, and the other. And while he did, I happened to have Michael Jackson's Whiskey Enthusiast book. And you guys have all been in a situation in class where you forgot that you had a test, and then all of a sudden you had to take a test, and you had that 10 minutes of panic before the class starts, and you read everything in your book to try to memorize it, and you have that what we call like 7-minute flash memory, right? So I read the page about each distillery while the whiskeys were being poured, so that I could go up and give a quick history of the distillery before Roger did his tasting notes. And it really kind of saved our ass, because we went from having a guy from Scotland who owned, like, I think at the time he was CEO or managing director of Gordon MacPhail, didn't show up. His replacement, who couldn't speak to folks, our replacement, who didn't know anything about whiskey, and then my dumb ass going up there to say, who didn't know anything about whiskey either, but fooled him enough to just not take questions and read what Michael Jackson had wrote and pretend like I did know it. Meanwhile, I'm behind the bar, like, scrambling. And that was my first whiskey tasting ever. And so after that, I decided I didn't want to depend on anybody else for that type to be put in that scenario again. So that's when I just started doing lots of Googling and Googling and Googling.
Yeah, I just think that's
Learn
like
as much about whiskey I could.
such a great story because you know, I think sometimes, especially earlier in your career, you kind of feel like a fraud to a certain degree, and you know, it's like that total fake it till you make it, and sometimes it does take that scenario to really kind of put that time in. So, you know, I know you say you did a lot of Googling. What were some of the other resources that you were using to go from this guy who just completely pretended to know what he was talking about to be considered the voice of whiskey for Los Angeles?
Well, that was kind of serendipitous in that in LA there's always been a pretty good whiskey community. You've got LA Whiskey Society and you've got the Plowed Society. A chunk of those guys are out here. And I was doing Googling, but I was kind of getting contradicting answers, if that makes sense, because this is 2007. Again, you could still get, you know, 30-year-old Moydart for $80 on the shelf, and you could get like Grand Reserve and Macallan's for $175 if you're in the right store. And it was before the boom had happened. Back then, like I remember trying to sell 17-year-old Linkwood single cask for $37.50 wholesale, and everyone told me to get out. No one's ever going to buy it. It's way too expensive. Just kicking the balls all over the place. And there was a book, I think it was just called Scotch Whiskey, where it just had a kind of comprehensive history of Scotch whiskey. That was JVS's focus at the time, which still is, but was then too. And I read that book, and that was a great resource. And then things just kind of started to snowball. In 2008, there was a guy named Bill Esparza who wrote for Chowhound, and he had a bunch of followers, and he knew a lot about cachaça, ironically. And so he and I were talking about booze together and trading back and forth. And I met him at a party because the manager for Frankie Valli wanted to do a private whiskey event, and somehow he had gotten a hold of my number. And so I did that for Frankie Valli staff. And that writer, Bill, wrote about it in Chowhound, and then it kind of went from there. And then the Daily Pint, who was one of our early clients, allowed me to start to expand their whiskey. And then they started winning awards. And then guys from like Adam Hers from LA Whiskey Society poured me copious amounts of rare bottles. And then the Plowed guys were pouring me stuff from the 60s, 50s, 80s. Like it was basically, you know, it was all work. And now it's just party. That's the way to put it, I suppose. Or back then it was party. And now it's all work, I suppose.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. So literally it was trial by fire. It was, no one else was doing it. There were a couple of books that I just kind of read and memorized, and then, but really no one else had done it yet. Like had the kids that are on the scene now, like had Elijah been around in 2007, I might not have been able to keep my job, because he's taken to it more of a fish in the water than I ever did. Or had guys like Josh Peters been really on the scene back then, it would have changed it. I was lucky in that the guys who were on the scene didn't want anything to do with other people. They're very much introverts, and we're keeping it all private.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're kind of able to build your reputation just because nobody else was willing to do that. Because I do know that was one thing that I kind of read throughout, you know, the different articles and stuff today, that it wasn't really, you weren't one of those guys that built yourself through social media, whether it be a blog or something like that. Like you just did so many events that you just became synonymous with whiskey in Southern California.
So if you can see the stern look on Sam Filmus's face right there, that's about sums up how my social media presence is. Like every week I get that call, Christopher, you need to get on Facebook.
It's a toxic place. Don't do it. So, you know, I'm just getting into my third year with JVS, and one of my first memories was reaching out to you, and I don't remember if it was either via phone or maybe it was when you had come up for Whiskeys of the World, but I remember asking you, because you know, what we're going to talk about tonight, Japanese whiskey, was an area that I wasn't, you know, really too savvy on, and I was like, well, you know, hey, what are the books that I need to read? Who are the people that I need to talk to? And then just straight deadpan, you just replied to me, you need to talk to me. And I thought that was so hilarious and very, you know, and kind of appropriate for, you know, what I would come to learn over the next 3 years. But, you know, where does that come from? I mean, what was really because, you know, if you if you become so synonymous with Scotch and you're putting all this time into it, what was the thing about Japanese whiskey that kind of, I wouldn't say you did an about phase, because obviously you're still very into Scotch and everything, but you definitely have kind of taken maybe to that like fish to water.
Well, there was a kind of opportunity, right? So my wife is Japanese, and so we've been together 10 years. So when I think we got together in 2009, and so it's just, again, whiskey boom still is in development, right? But at the same time, we're going to Japan together, and there's all these other expressions over there of Japanese whiskeys and of Scotch whiskeys and of a bunch of rare bourbons that you're just not seeing in America. And so I'm just able to try them, like those Hanyu bottles that everyone reads about that are like $5,000 and $6,000. The Hasegawa Liquors used to sell them by the shot for $2.50. So you could go into the liquor store and say, I want to try this bottle, that bottle, that bottle, that bottle, and they would just pour them for you, and then you could take one home for $50. It was just a completely different time then, and it was really, really good juice. Like it was really intriguing to try all those things, and so just once again, just was exposed to it and took to it.
Was there any particular whiskey that you had tried that you're just kind of like, people are not appreciating this enough, and I know I can make something out of this category?
There were two things. So, I mean, all around, I thought it was a great category. Like I love Scotch. I love all whiskeys. I love all distillate. Like I'll get shithoused on mezcal every now and again, and it's like one of the best things ever. And especially like mezcal from Miahuatlan, where it's nice and got a lot of mineral and clay. But I remember realizing how unappreciated it was on a global scale when my wife and I would go to this bar called Campbellton Lock. And of course they spelled Campbellton wrong. And anyone of my friends who's gone to Japan, I recommend this bar to them. It has like 8 seats, 600 whiskeys at any given time. And they rotate throughout the year. And they had Hanyu's King of Diamonds, and it was $15 a shot. And I got a shot of it, and I was drinking it. And the Japanese guy next to me literally looked at me and through my wife translated, like, what are you doing drinking that Japanese swill when they have all these good Scotch whiskeys? And I remember thinking to myself, this is like 20-something-year-old first fill sherry cask, like classic, like the stuff dreams are made of now. And I remember thinking to myself, I think this is pretty good. Like it's nice. And so that was when it let me know that it was underappreciated. That and the fact that I was driving around Orange County, Elijah's neighborhood, and buying Yamazaki 18 for $80 a bottle. Like it was just, no one knew Southern was giving a 1-on-6 on that product. Like it was super cheap. Japanese whiskey was undercutting all of our Scotch whiskey as far as pricing on the shelf, right? Like 18-year-old Scotch whiskey had started to get more expensive, whereas you could still get the Japanese stuff incredibly cheap. And so it was a value, is what it was, a value to quality at the time. And that's what drew me to it, because I was like, I can get these for next to nothing. It's fun.
And then so you look at the category, and you see those single malts, they exist and stuff like that, and which there was Kikori that was around, but there really wasn't anybody doing rice whiskeys. So you're responsible for bringing Oishi and Fukano to the American market. Like and some of the stories that I had read about how you went about that, I think it was really interesting. Can you elaborate just on like the stories of both of those different expressions and how they came to be?
Yeah, so that was a 2-year process before we could even get any juice into the country. It was a very, very long, tedious process to make all that happen. But really, what it started with was as you guys know, the community, the booze community in general, is a pretty close community, and when you're an asshole to other people in the industry, it doesn't really suit anything for what we're all trying to accomplish. And I was buddies with a guy who had a sake import company. And he and I would kind of see each other at like LA Wine Fest and different things. We'd always pour each other booze. And then we ended up like kind of hanging out and having dinner every now and again and kind of catching up and just relaxing. And one day he brought me a sample of a Fukano cask, because he was importing their shochu at the time. And he brought me a sample of a Fukano cask that was a first fill American oak cask. And I think it was like only 6 years old or something. And it was really good. It was really, really good. And I was like, why aren't you bringing this in? He's like, it's not shochu. It doesn't qualify. I'm like, well, what are you going to do with it? He goes, I'm not going to do anything with it. And I was like, can I do something with this? He goes, yeah. And he had already introduced me before because they had come to the country a few times. And again, we would have shared a beer. And luckily, they're from the same prefecture that my wife's from. So next time we went back home, we just went down to see him. And it took, Fukano-san took longer to convince than Oi-san, but it was like, they remembered, because this stuff dates back, 40. They've been putting stuff in barrel for 40 years, and laws for their products have changed in that 40 years to where things that they used to do are now prohibited, and things they used to be able to do, they'd like to do again. And so when we brought them the idea, it all came around into, sorry, I'm trying to keep my train of thought, but the king has spoken.
It's okay. We'll edit it out in post, so
yeah,
don't worry.
There's no post. I know
that is correct. There's not. But
anyways,
it's nice to say that though.
So the idea was, why not expand the pie, right? Like, good booze should be brought to the public, period. It's the same thing with like the Jamaican casks that Sam and I have purchased now. It's like, if it's just good, if it's good and it makes sense, just bring it in and let the market enjoy it, and then we can all share it. So it took 2 years of trying to get the compliance done. It took 2 years of research because people were having a problem with the idea of whiskey being made from rice, but there's a huge history about all that we can talk about later if you want. And then, I don't know, they're cool family distilleries, right? They're just like, yeah, this sounds like a great project. Go have fun. Their business isn't based on it. Their business is based on their shochu business in Japan. It's how they pay their bills. So this is kind of like it's like when any of us start to explore a new thing, we just kind of have fun with it if we can. And that's what it started out as.
So with with this stuff in Japan, it's actually not considered whiskey. And like you had mentioned that, they're a sochu producer, or at least historically had been. I'd read that there is a part of that process where they actually strip it of color after they age it, and that was something that kind of inspired you to come like, well, why don't you just leave it like this and bring it to America? And I was wondering if you could talk more about that sochu process that ends up really being the difference maker between whiskey and sochu.
Yeah, so like if you go to barrel aging in shochu is not really, shochu is normally drank as a clear spirit. It might have been aged in clay, but rarely is it aged in barrels. And there were only a few families that were really sticking into the cask for a long time. Like even if you go to the Hakushu distillery now and they show the different categories of whiskey, beer, and shochu, like when it gets to barrels, shochu stops. They don't acknowledge the fact that any of it will go into barrels. So like the beer chart will show fermentation, stop. The shochu chart will show fermentation, distillation, stop. And then the whiskey chart will show fermentation, distillation, and then barrels. And it's all set up in like an Excel spreadsheet. And the laws of shochu are as such. You must be able to hit it with a beam of light and it's not going to reflect the X amount of particles. Like the darkest, I'll show you. I figured that would come up. So this is as dark as shochu is allowed to be when it's cast aged. And if it's any darker than that, then you have to run it through. You can either add new make to it to bring the color down, or you run it through these HEPA filters that'll just suck it all out. And it's just like when you chill filter whiskey, right? We all know about chill filtering whiskey and what those filters can do. It's the same thing that you can do with shochu to get it to where this looks darker on the screen than it is. It's super light.
Whereas can you elaborate on the light refraction, because that just sounds like insanity to me.
Yeah, well, so you shoot something with it, like anything you shoot a piece of coffee, like a glass of coffee with a beam of light, not much light's going to come out the other side. Whereas if you shoot a glass of shochu, it should be able to go through.
And that's like they have like a little setup that they walk around and they just like shoot the light through. I mean, I think maybe
I know they can go and test it, and I know that they can go and test it, and I know that there's been a couple slap on the wrist for having your product too dark over there.
Yeah, I just the thought process of watching that sequence take place is I'm having a hard time getting past that because it just seems hilarious.
Yeah, but look at this. Hold on. Like this is 4-year-old Fukano like wine cask. You see what I mean? And so when you hold them up together, like it doesn't work, right? So yeah. If you want to make this into a shochu, you can. You just got to make that to where it doesn't have that color. And if you think about like the general principle of it, you're fundamentally changing what the distillate's going to taste like. It's still going to be really good distillate. It's just not going to have this. And so to have this as this, you've got to really the only option is to bottle it as whiskey for export market. So that's what we did. That makes sense. But they used to be able to do this, like pre mid 1980s. You could have shochu that looked like this. It wasn't a problem. Oisan's father was putting stuff into sherry cask years and years ago. Did a bunch of it in '74 to celebrate his birth year. And it's all like this. But in the mid 80s, there was do you want me to go into this, Drew? Do you guys want to hear about the?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if someone doesn't like what they're hearing, they can leave. So,
Right. So
you
in
know,
the mid
no
80s,
peer
there was a
pressure here.
yeah. In the mid 80s, there was a $6 billion trade deficit between the UK and Japan. This, UK was buying $6 billion more worth of goods out of Japan than Japan was buying out of the UK. And there were also, and in Japan, there was an internal thing where shochu was being taxed at a lower rate and whiskey was being taxed at a higher rate. And there was a way to try to find this balance. And Margaret Thatcher came up with, basically, she took a group of people and she said, look, you guys have got to change the Scotch whiskey import tariffs. Because remember, in '86, Scotch whiskey's in the toilet, right? Like, but Convamore's closed, Port Ellen's closed a few years before, Banff closed a few years before. In the early '90s, you're going to lose Rosebank and Little Mill. Like this, just distilleries are going for pennies on the dollar, and everything's crashing. The world's coming to an end. Dogs and cats living together. It's anarchy. And the compromise that everyone comes up with that kind of screwed families like Oisan and Fukano-san was that they would raise the taxes on shochu, which in all fairness, they kind of needed to do because the whiskey taxes were a lot higher. And they lowered the taxes on Scotch whiskey import tariffs, which is when you see a shift in the way that Japanese whiskey is done. And you see a shift in the drinking market of Japan, of them moving over towards Scotch whiskeys as opposed to other drinks. And the final thing they did was they changed what shochu is allowed to be bottled as. So it was probably the most brilliant thing Margaret Thatcher did to protect the Scotch whiskey industry, because then she recognized that the stuff being distilled down in Kumamoto looked and tasted just like whiskey, even though it had a different name. And we can talk about why they had different names. That has to do with 500 years of history and trade. But she recognized it as a potential threat. And by having this shift made, it kind of establishes the categories as two very separate things. Like shochu's got to follow that color suit, so it's not going to carry that heavy barrel influence. Whereas whiskey, remember at the time, there's a lot of old whiskey on the market because there's lakes of it out there, is going to carry that barrel influence. And to drive home how pivotal this was onto the global market of whiskey and the awareness of whiskey in general is in Kumamoto, where Fukano-san and Oisan is, there's 28 distilleries operating. In the prefecture next to theirs and the state next to theirs, there's 185, I think. So had that law not happened, and had we had 30 years of a transition from maybe not clear spirit, but stuff that started to find its way more into barrels, because it's not until the 1970s that barrels are pretty accessible down in that region. It's not even until like 1960s, 1970s that you can even get to those cities easily because the tunnels aren't even built yet. It could have fundamentally changed like distillate on a global scale, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You follow the train there. So she was able to nip that in the bud by making it what it was. So 30 years later, you have it back now as whiskey for export market, because that's what it qualifies as. And so what you guys are drinking when you drink Oishi or Fukano is you're literally bringing back a beverage that existed, 50, 60 years ago, but then was made illegal 30 something years ago. My math is shit, but you guys know what I'm trying to say.
And so the process of making this rice whiskey, I mean, is it just the exact same as what we're used to seeing in whiskey? I mean, I also know like in Japanese whiskey, they talk a lot about like, I believe it's koji is used. Is that the same when it comes to the production of rice whiskey?
Yeah. So koji is unique to rice whiskey. You have some American distilleries that are using it now, and it's actually got a pretty big history in American whiskey. So in Japan, they don't make whiskey by using the koji process. When the word whiskey in Japan, sorry, let me just take it back. So if you look at the history of distillation in the countries, Japan was a closed country until, hold on, I got my little reference chart. Japan's a closed country until like 1853. Before then, you only have one port that the external world is allowed to trade in through Japan, and that's the port of Nagasaki, and the Dutch were kind of running stuff through there, and they were trading spices and deer pelts and pulling out silk and so on and so forth. But I haven't found any record of them trading whiskey in and out. It's in 1853 that Commodore Perry brings, an American actually, brings casks of whiskey over to Japan as gifts as he's trying to convince them to open the country back up to trade for other countries besides the Dutch, because the Dutch have a monopoly on it. And he showed up and he brought like a cask, small cask of whiskey for some folks. And they said, all right, cool, come back in a year. We'll be in a typical American. He shows back up in 6 months and he brings a large armada with him, and he brings a whole bunch of stuff, including casks as gift for each individual person that he's meeting. And he kind of gets trade open back up with Japan. And then you have like 20 years of, it's called, I think it's called Yoshu. Hold on, let me look at the word. Yeah, Yoshu starts to become known in Japan. And then what you have is where, if you look on Wikipedia, you'll see 1870 is where you start to hear the words, like when you start to read about whiskey in Japan. And what's going on then is you have guys that are in Japan basically taking shochu or some type of other neutral make spirit, adding dye, adding color and adding herbs to it to try to replicate what they think a whiskey might taste like. The trade really isn't established yet. And that's why the word whiskey doesn't come in until 1870, because it's coming over from the Scottish word ushkaba, right? Meanwhile, you have a whole rich history of distilling in Japan that dates back to 1546. And if you, again, look at the history of the two, Aristotle talks about distilling in what is it, 4th century BC or something. And then it kind of goes up. Let's see if you guys are looking at me like this. I think it would go up like that, where this goes up to Scotland and this goes over to Southeast Asia. And the Portuguese bring distilling over to Southeast Asia. And so it makes sense that when it gets to Japan in 1546, you would call it by a different word than whiskey, because whiskey, first written record of whiskey isn't until 1494, and that's all the way across the world. So there's no cross-pollination there of ideas. So in Japan, they developed the koji process for their distillation, because koji is basically in Scotch whiskey, you do a malting, which gives you alpha amylase, which provides the enzyme for the yeast to be healthy and to feed off the starches and sugars in the grain. Whereas in Japan, they'll use a thing called koji, and it's basically a mold. And for anyone that gets a little bit nervous about hearing the word mold on the whiskey, if you've ever had soy sauce, you've eaten koji. If you've ever had miso soup at a sushi place, you've had koji. It's an integral part of a lot of Asian food and a lot of like global diet. It helps to convert starches into digestible sugars and good sugars for fermenting, and it actually helps to kick off the fermentation process. So they would use that with wood ash back in the 1500s to kind of get whatever they were distilling, whatever they were fermenting, cleaned up. And so the difference between the two processes is, I'll operate under the assumption that you guys all know how Scotch whiskey's done. You all know how bourbon's done. But what they would do with the koji is they would sprinkle the koji onto steamed rice, let it sit for 40 hours, and that would get that rice ready to get up and running. Then they'll add water and yeast and let that ferment for 7 days, and that gives you your moromi, which is like your starter, really. Then you'll move that over into another fermentation tank, and that's done in clay pots in the ground. Then you'll pull it out of there and you move it over into another fermentation tank, and you'll add more steamed rice to it. And that'll all mix together, and then you end up with a 16 to 18% alcohol by volume, like ferment or your wash at that point. So you've only used grain in the whole process. It's just the way you malted your sugars, the way you got your starches and the digestible sugars for the yeast is a little bit different. That makes sense.
Yeah. So is that time period? So it sounds like it might be. Is it like in the
21 days all in?
21 days all in. Now, is that pretty standard, or does it kind of vary by producer?
My understanding, again, because Sam's working me so hard, I don't have enough time to go skive off in Japan and learn about all this as much as I should be. But my understanding is that's kind of universal. It with the sake producers, with everything, it takes a while to get there. And just like with the sake producers, they'll only produce maybe 8 months out of the year, October to April, because the cooler months are better for the fermentation, whereas in the hotter months, the ferment might get a little too hot and it gives them off flavors that they don't want. But it's more for like, because of those law changes of the 80s, and because of the fact that the distillate itself is there's a chunk of it that's generally consumed as a new make, if you will, or consumed as unaged. The emphasis is on really getting your distillate right. Whereas with bourbon, you rely on new charred oak casks that are mighty beasts that can tackle a pretty mighty spirit, and between the two of them interacting with each other, you can come up with a very elegant, beautiful product. But they depend on each other to get that done. If you've ever had new make bourbon, you know that it's, while it's fun, it's just it's kind of a mean spirited little shit. Like it'll bite you if you're biting it. Whereas the distillate that they're making over in Japan, like it has its own GI. It's got its own like globally acknowledged region, just like cognac or just like champagne, where they make the distillate a very certain way, and it can be drank brand new or it can be matured, and it works fine. The to kind of put it in perspective, what the koji helps to do is, in potatoes you'll get peptides, and peptides, when they're broken down by yeast, will give you methanol, which is the part you can't drink. If you add koji to potatoes, it breaks apart those peptides, is my understanding of it, and you actually are able to get the methanol out of your ferment. So with the rice whiskeys, there is no methanol in the ferment. You can there's no hedge. The second it comes off the still, it's consumable and it's safe. So just a little bit of a different process. Like same thing, they don't need copper stills. They can use stainless steel stills, because there's no, like in Scotland, they'll talk about the copper is important to pull off conagers or off flavors to give you a sweeter spirit. It's not necessary in the south of Japan, because it's not, those things aren't there to begin with in the ferment that would then translate to the distillate. So it's, again, it's just an expansion of pie, right? Like you're knocking out bourbon, you're knocking out scotch. Like those are great categories. So just expand the pie and give a new flavor.
So I think you've kind of answered this question just through talking about like the history and stuff, and it's funny to hear about, you know, these laws that go into place, because so often, at least like I see feedback, and it's not exclusive to whiskey. I see it in rum all the time too, but like people talk about tradition, and those traditions that they're referring to are like 20 years old, you know, so they're really not traditions. But when you hear people talk about Japanese rice whiskeys as not being whiskeys, what is your typical response to that? Like without going down like that long, you know, rabbit hole of like all the history and stuff like that, like everything that we just discussed, which was great for this scenario, but not necessarily great if you're sitting, you know, in front of somebody who is trying to like pull a fast one and be like, that's not real whiskey.
So it's hard to tell. It's hard to get a short answer out of a dude who's full of so much hot air, right? So how do I? So the short answer is, I mean, give me a definition of whiskey: a distilled spirit made from a grain and aged in an oak cask. There you go. It's a distilled spirit made from a grain and aged in an oak cask. If someone has a problem with koji, you can remind them that, you know, pre-1900, we used to make American whiskey with koji for a while before a bunch of politics hit there. Someone has a problem with it being rice, you know, Jim Beam and Buffalo Trace both made bourbons that had rice in them. So that's the best you got.
Okay. And then, so we've already gotten an introduction to your son today. Sorry, my dog's
I know
to go over
that
to
look.
the grandparents' house, and so
I know that look.
I have to say goodbye to her before she goes back to duty.
As you do. You'll see me tomorrow.
But you know, one of the cool things that you know we had in the inventory, like when I first started, was actually a cask that was made with your son's name on it.
Oh,
and I just, you know, I think that's just awesome. I mean, how many kids just have a whiskey named after them when they've been, you know, in this world for a day? You know, that's not very common. But what was that process like? How did you get to that point? I mean, what, you know, could you talk about that whiskey a little bit, because it is a really cool expression. And then also, how many of those bottles does he have? Do you have stored away for him to, you know, open up on his 21st birthday?
He's got less than he probably should. So that was basically, we all know that our kids love us when they're young, and then when they get into their teenage years, we're the most uncool person they've ever met. And so that was me flexing on him as an infant, so that when he's saying, "You're not cool, Dad," I'm going to say, "Let me show you how fucking cool I am, boy." And I'm going to, like I did a whiskey with their name on it. But the way it came about was, you know, we were working on this project before Kaito was born, and Oisan is like he's a really good friend at this point, and he's a really super cool guy. And when Kaito was born, I think I kind of mentioned that I want to get a cask for him for when he's older, like he could have. And that got misconstrued by Oisan to say, "Oh, you want a cask with his name on it? Yeah, let's do it." And I was like, "Okay, let's do it." And so we just did one. And it was 660 bottles, I think, and that's way too much. But I maybe still have 10 of them. I mean, at the most. This was back when Sam and I were first starting GRC as well. So it was, we needed to. I can't just take 660 bottles out of inventory and pay costs, or like you got to pay bills. It didn't work that way back then.
You have 10 bottles, and I haven't just one. And I remember you calling me from Japan saying, "Do you mind if we got the exceptional sherry cask, and the distiller gladly agreed to put Kaido's name, my son's name, on it." And I said, "Only if you're sure that it's your son, I can do it."
You see that cheeks and double chin, he's mine. Don't worry.
You
got a big forehead too.
And since then, I call him King Kaito. And I mean it. He's the greatest kid that I ever met in my life.
Yeah,
good job, Chris.
He's gonna terrorize soon.
That's awesome. That's actually, a really great segue into kind of where I wanted to take the conversation next is, you're working for JVS and, you're establishing yourself, as this whiskey expert and stuff like that. What made you want to get into the importation of spirits? Was it just like that, going back to that, seeing that gap in in the whiskey world that hey, we can fill this with Japanese whiskey, or what were some of the driving factors to kind of to add to your daily requirements of workload?
So Sam Filmus is the best boss I've ever had in my entire life. Like I've done a lot of different things in my past, and I worked at a hospital. I dug ditches, played rock and roll for a very brief while. I'm just a bunch of nonsense, and I've had some good bosses and I've had some not so good bosses. And when I came out to work with JVS, again, 2007, writer strike hits in 2008, the economy crashes in 2008, and we weathered all that together. And while I weathered that with Sam, he was very, very patient with me. And I'm really good at not doing things the right way. And he was patient with me through all of it. And when I started to step beyond what my job description was, and JVS saying, "Hey, I think we should bring this brand in. Hey, I think we bring this brand in," he was always supporting me. He goes, "Okay, go do it. Okay, go do it. Okay, go do it." Rarely, every now and again, he would say no, but for the most part, he was like, "Yeah, let's do that." And there were a few other things that I kind of wanted to do that didn't quite flesh out when, like, I would bring it to him and it just wasn't in the cards at the time. And when this came around, I brought it to him and he goes, you've done your time. Like, through the thinnest of times, you were there with us. And he's like, there was another company called Georgian Royal Collection, and the partner of that company wanted out. And he's like, my business partner in this company wants out. If you want to buy it, and it was basically for nothing. I mean, there was some money involved, but it was nothing. It'd be less than what it costs to start up license. If you want to buy them out, you can buy them out, and then you can take this and you can run with it as yours. And so he, like, that's what it was. It wasn't ever like, I'm going to go out and start this business. I'm going to go out and do this. And it was more of just Sam just trying to look out for me, because I'll credit it a little bit to when JVS South, again, when I joined JVS South, there'd been quite a lot of turnover. And even my boss then had got headhunted out to go do seafood importing. And I stepped into that position, and we just kind of grew it together. And so it was the next natural step, like, as JVS has grown. And I started working for ImpEx the day that it got started. And then it was just kind of like a natural progression of it, if that makes sense. So it was just more him looking out for me than me having any type of real gumption.
Right. But I mean, but still, like, doing those extra things kind of put you in that position and stuff like that. So, I mean, that's why I'm doing all these happy hours. I'm going to have Sam help me start my media empire. So, that's what I'm doing all this for. To kind of bring it back to Japanese whiskey, it's, I guess, for lack of a better term, it's really kind of reached a fever pitch. And people love to argue the merits of Japanese whiskey. Dave Broom being one of them, who's just kind of trying to get all these different regulations put into place. And so, with all these guidelines that are being proposed, and like the definition of Japanese whiskey changing, with a lot of that, all those things being said, like, what are your impressions of that? And if it was up to you, what are some of the guidelines that you would like to see be implemented, in this scenario?
I don't, so a couple of things. One is with Oishi and Fukano, I don't call them Japanese whiskeys. I call them whiskeys from Japan, because I understand that Japanese whiskey was founded off of blending, and it was founded off of really trying to mimic the Scotch style. And so as far as an opinion on all of it, like when you study your history as far as the category goes, everyone's allowed to have their opinions. It's like, but the true history of Japanese whiskey was never about the provenance of the distillate, nor was it about, in the beginning, it was about doing a malt style distillate, but very quickly it evolved out of that. And if you look like Fujiko Temba and what they're doing, they've got a doubler on their still. They're basically making bourbon over there for their column still. And they're using corn. That's really what it looks like. It's this massive industrial complex with these column stills and then a doubler, and then it goes into the tanks to be put into barrels. And it is what it is. And that's an aspect of it. And the Scotch whiskey styles, like what they're doing at Chichibu now, where it's like very classic, old school, Forsyth stills, basically making Scottish single malt in Japan. That is what it is as well. So they're going to do what they're going to do no matter what. But I would just tell everyone to kind of relax. And, if the whiskey's good, enjoy it. And if it's not good, don't enjoy it. But don't go hating on folks because it's not done the way that you want it to be done. Because that wasn't ever the history. Like when Suntory got started, they had Yamazaki, but when they released their first blend, now maybe I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Like they were pulling grain whiskey out of Okinawa, which meant it would have either been rice distillate or cane distillate, right? And if you look at the tax laws, you didn't even have to put real whiskey in a bottle of Japanese whiskey, I think, until like 1968. Pre-1968, third grade whiskey had anywhere from 0 to less than 5% actual whiskey in the bottle. So it was always just about the blending. And so what is Japanese whiskey? What is the history of it? Where do you, like, do you really want to constrict it? Like, I don't know if that's necessarily the right move. If you make it just a clone of Scotch whiskey and a clone of bourbon, are you really offering anything new? Or are you just like, what's great? Like, where's the greatness can be done in executing that one little thing for sure. But why limit it to that? Like, why listen to rock and roll only when you can listen to jazz and hip hop and all these other categories of music made, like, done by producers from that area? So instead of like saying, oh no, man, you're Japanese, you can only make rock albums. Like, I don't buy into it. I don't think that would be sad to see happen, but I'm nobody, so it doesn't matter.
Well, you're the voice of whiskey in LA, so don't discount yourself.
Yeah, that article's from like 3 years ago by now, for sure.
Yeah, but you were the inaugural one, so that lasts forever. So with today's modern day whiskey and our Japanese whiskey, with the approvals, a lot more just distillation licenses and everything like that. There is this very complicated history that we've come to learn already tonight. But like, who do you see right now, production wise, that you think is just doing really cool stuff that you're excited about?
In Japan?
In Japan, yeah.
I like what Oisan does. Like, I back him 100%. Dude, this dude's so cool that I'm going to get him in on this. Hold on. I want to see if he can join for a few minutes. That dude's so cool. Like, 10 75-year-old sherry casks came into Japan, 10 of them, that had held sherry for 75 years. He bought 8. Ariake Sangyo, which, Suntory has their own internal cooperage, but Ariake Sangyo provides a lot of folks with their barrels. And those casks weren't cheap, man. I think they could be leakers. No one really knows that much about them. They smell like old Macallan or leak. Like, if you've ever had Macallan from the 60s, and that old rancio kind of like garbage finish on them, that's overripe fruit thing. Like, those casks smell like that. And they came in, he's like, what do you think? I was like, I think those are cool. He's like, cool. I bought a chunk of them. I didn't realize he bought 80% that had come in to the country. Everyone's kind of doing Mizunara, but he's investing in that. He invested in Sakura cask, where the Sakuras were grown in the same region as the distillery, like just down the street. So he's exploring terroir that way. All of the rice is grown locally. Like, he grows 30% of his own rice. He's from a distillation standpoint, he's like he's doing Madeira cask, Banyuls cask, which is French fortified wine, port casks, Isla casks, sherry casks, brandy casks. He played around with some Nuo, played around with some rum. He's just kind of having fun with it, like reduced pressure distillation, regular pressure distillation, doing individual grains of rice distillation. So he's distilled Yamada Nishiki rice by itself, Gohyaku Mangoku rice by itself. And he's playing around with all that. So for me, that's very exciting. I really dig what he's doing.
Just to be clear, that's Oishi,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah, just want to make sure because sometimes you reel these names off a little bit quicker than I can understand and might.
You don't like my Japanese with the Georgia drawl? It's perfect pronunciation.
Like I said, it's the East meets West, mouth of the South. I'm into it. So Catherine has asked if you could spell the name for her because it's going into her epic notebook. So
Oishi is Ohishi. It means big stone. If you ever go to Japan and you'll see the toilets, they've got a handle that goes two ways. This one is for the big flush. Here, this one is for the big flush, whereas this one's for the little flush. So O is big and Ishi is stone. Not to be confused with Oishi, which means delicious, but that's a different spelling and a different kanji.
And then, obviously there's been, part of the excitement around Japanese whiskey is that you're seeing, less and less age statements, things like Hibiki no longer does the 17 and so on and so on. And I know that, us at JVS, like we're not hung up on age statements and we have, a ton of examples that prove how ridiculous the emphasis on age statements can be. But for something like Japanese whiskey, which is still kind of carving out its place in history, what do you think the effects of that are going to be on Japanese whiskey as a whole, or if any?
Well, I think it'll come back, right? Because if you look at the warehouses of Hakushu and you look at the warehouses of Fuji Gotemba, I mean, they're not small, man. They're holding tens of thousands of barrels in there. But that's one area where we kind of got lucky, actually, with the Oishi and Fukano stuff, is that because of the changes of the 80s, it eventually shochu consumption kind of dropped, whereas they were keeping production pretty well going. So Oison's got, I think, 1,300 barrels of aged stock that we can pull from, and he's building another warehouse that'll hold 500 barrels that he's immediately going to fill up. So I think we'll be okay on that front. But where it's going to go, it's going to be just like with Scotch whiskey, right? Like you see Talisker 8 cash strength, you see Ardbeg 8 Wee Beastie, or Ardbeg 5 Wee Beastie, and everything's kind of trended down. They tried it where age statements disappeared for a little bit in Scotch whiskey, and then everyone like kind of got numb to that. At first they were like, oh, it used to be 12-year, now it isn't. Same thing with the whole Elijah Craig thing, right? Used to say 12-year, now it doesn't. And then people started to get numb to it, and now they come back with 5. They're like, oh, this is 5, cool. Oh, this is 8, cool. That might be where the trend goes. Who knows?
Yeah. What are some of the brands that are coming out of Japan right now that people aren't talking about? I mean, and I'm sure you hear this too, but if I walk into an establishment and I'm like, hey, I sell Japanese whiskey, a lot of the first response I get is like, oh, you sell Yamazaki? And it's like,
yeah.
My first thought immediately is like, how do you not understand this business yet? You own a store. But once I get over that part, I'm just like, there's so many, really cool things out there. We have the Matsui distiller with a lot of the fun expressions that they've released recently. And again, with so many new distilling licenses that have been approved over the past couple of years, that there's more competition entering the market. Is there anything that you've seen that's like, man, that's really cool. I like what they're doing. And that's something that nobody's talking about. And maybe that's that $80 or $50 or $60 bottle that's going to be crazy in a couple of years. I mean, do you have any bold predictions for us?
Well, I would just say, like, in the $200 bottle range, Chichibu is really putting out good juice. Like, that guy knows what he's doing. He's got Mizunara washbacks. He's really putting out really good stuff. In the $50 to $80 price point, I don't know. I'm not the right guy to ask about that anymore. You know, when 4 years ago I was really good at seeing where everything was going, but now I'm not in the trenches as much as I used to be, so I kind of don't see where it's going. I know that I get the feeling, because I don't actually know the full stocks of Fukano. He's a little bit more secretive on it, but I get the feeling that his age stuff is starting to run a little bit low. So I could see where those, you know, you can almost argue that not enough was made for it to really influence a secondary. But when you look at the reviews of it, if those stocks start to dwindle beyond what they are, then maybe there could be some type of reach on that one. But yeah, I mean, it was, you know, any of the Nika stuff, any of the Suntory stuff that had age statements on it from a few years ago is super highly desirable now. Where it's going to go from there, I mean, Chichibu's only laying down more stuff, so I imagine more will be made available. Yeah, man, not much of an answer for you. I apologize.
That's okay. I'll just hold it against you forever. You know, you have a history of being a little bit of a rock star, and I know those days are pretty far behind you. But similar to the conversation that we had last night with Joshua Hatton, you know, what's the soundtrack that you're listening to when it comes to drinking whiskey? I mean, who's the band or the artist that you're just kind of like, that person makes music drinking whiskey right there, like that?
Given my current situation, the Frozen 2 soundtrack is the soundtrack of my whiskey drinking. Like, my God, I'm listening to that quite a bit right now.
I hate how much I can relate to that answer. I really do.
It's a great soundtrack, man.
It's a great soundtrack. I mean,
the one with the deer, like it sounds like an old Chicago song from the 80s. It's kind of,
it's very 80s ballad. I totally agree.
That's what I'm drinking whiskey to. And let me tell you, like, you hear it for the third time in a day and the whiskey starts to taste pretty good.
Yeah, I'm on the heavy rotation of that as well. So yeah, I get it, man. I feel your pain. But fortunately those songs have depth, so you know, we get a lot out of it. Now for ImpEx with a capital E, what is the future for you guys? Like, what do you see as you know, kind of like the next projects and things that you're excited about, what the impact that they're going to have?
From my point of view?
Yeah, from your point of view.
Ask me again in 10 days. there's like, continue, like, everything's exciting. So yeah, I used to play rock and roll, right? And we like, I view ImpEx and JVS kind of like two bands, and they're both like, they're two great indie bands, and everything that ImpEx has done for me is still exciting because we're getting to see the evolution of it, right? Like, we've celebrated 10 years of our relationship with Kilhoman. So that's still exciting, watching that distillery develop, seeing what's going on with Single Malts of Scotland, like the Jamaican casks that have just arrived. I can't wait to get my samples so I can go through there and figure out what's going to happen there with the Japanese stuff. Is going to be, as the Japanese stuff continues to grow and evolve, it's just all exciting, right? Like, it's, you got to remember in 2007, and this is why I stay excited. It's also why I stay a little bit numb from it, but I get numb about whiskey sometimes because it's like, I want to see how it's going to evolve and become better instead of how it's going to evolve and come better, like better as a sipping product versus better as a marketing product. And but in 2007, it was so hard to sell good whiskey. I mean, it was just, no one cared. People bought a lot of vodka, but really no one cared about whiskey. And to watch all of that kind of shift now, and to watch it grow beyond whiskey and into agave and into, like, everyone keeps saying rum's going to hit, and then it never hits. But hopefully it hits. Like, just to see, like, everyone, like, just drinking good booze together is exciting, right? Like, does that make any sense? You know,
yeah, no, it totally does. I mean, and
that's what I think is exciting.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things as well, where I have long been beating that drum of rum being the next thing, and then it becomes mezcal, and then I'm like, shit, like, I'm wrong again. As much as I want to be right about that, I'm just haven't been. And I'm a lot more realistic about my rum aspirations today than I maybe was a few years back. But that's fine because there's just more for me and it's still affordable. So I'm very okay with that. One question that I asked Joshua last night, which I actually think is going to make a little bit of a staple now, is you've experienced so many different whiskeys from so many different places, and you've had these truly unique experiences that I think a lot of people would be jealous of, over, your career. And I'm curious if there was a bottle, that you've had, during the course of your career that could kind of have that infinity pour to it. It's just never going to run out. Like, what is that bottle for you?
I don't know if I fully understand. Like, what is the be all end all bottle?
Well, I mean, it's, it could be your desert island whiskey or spirit, or just like the one that you had that you're like, I wish this thing would never run out. Like, I know it's going to run out and it's a bummer, but I wish it never would. Like, if you had that, wizarding power to make a whiskey bottle last forever, what's that bottle for you?
Shit, man. I don't know. There was a Book of Kells, a Longmorn 48-year-old that was really good. First fill sherry cask. There was a Moydart 30 was a really good one. Basically, that was a blended malt of 30 and older Springbank with a lot of older stuff. If it's a desert island, I'm drinking Coors Light. I don't know, man. What do I keep going back to? I drink a lot of Oishi Isla cask. I ain't gonna lie, because it's not too smoky. I don't know if there is one. I really don't know if there is one, because again, it goes back to music, right? I can't listen to the same thing every day because I'll go bananas.
It doesn't even necessarily have to be that one that's every day. I mean, I feel the same way. Like, I definitely don't want to drink the same thing every day. But if, again, if there's like that bottle, like, hey, I know this is just always going to be kick ass, like that's more so, I guess, maybe what the question is. But, you gave us like 7 answers, so I'll take that as one.
Awesome.
Does anybody have any questions for?
I want to get Oysan on this line. You guys want to ask him a few questions? He just said he'd join.
Yeah, definitely.
You want a distiller from Japan on?
We haven't touched Japan yet. So, the virtual happy hour part of the ImpEx capital E media conglomerate, we're into it. We're trying to expand here.
All right, hold on, guys.
If anybody else has a good answer for what their perfect music is for drinking whiskey, you're allowed to chime in right now.
Willie Nelson's pretty good too. Ain't gonna lie.
I've been the Highland Park sound playlist that's on Spotify is pretty great. There's a lot of Black Keys on there, and there's something about the Black Keys and whiskey that just really go well together. Because it's enough of an up tempo that you kind of want to go just like, kick open some doors, but then you're also kind of like, but I can sit here still. But if I need to, I can.
The Pogues is good drinking whiskey. Any type of Irish music.
Yeah, that could be it as well. Let's see. Megan said, Little Smokies. Is that music? Or just a delicious treat?
Tenacious D.
Tenacious D is also a really, really great option. One thing that we've kind of glossed over for most of this, I don't know if everybody can see him, but Robert's wearing a little tiny cowboy hat, and I don't know if that's because the hat's that small or his head's that big. I'm not 100% sure, but
Pink Floyd is good, yeah.
It might be a little bit of both.
I've drank Loch Dew, Robert. More. I've never turned it down.
Hey, didn't we used to sell that like 7 years ago? 6 years ago?
We sold Q Dub, which is the Loch Dew knockoff. We didn't even have the real Loch Dew. We had the knockoff Loch Dew.
Okay, he is on.
Oi-san's on?
Oh.
Oi-san, konnichiwa.
では、
元気ですか？
元気ですよ。クリスは大丈夫？
ちょっと大丈夫ですね。ちょっと、今これ飲みます。
Oh, Sakura.
Yeah. Hold on, guys. Let me get an interpreter for you. I'm gonna unplug the thing. It might get loud for a second. 大丈夫。おいさん、英語頑張れや。I told him to go for his English.
Oi-san, your English is better than his Japanese. Trust me. How you doing?
I can't speak in English. I can speak broken English. Okay?
Nice to see you. Hope you're doing well.
おいさん、今もろみ作ってますか？
もう作ってない。
終わりますか？去年。
終わり。
So they're already done distilling for this year. So 毎日は何の仕事をしますか？全然ゲームを遊びましょうか。
ボトリング。
Bottling? Yeah.
そうそう。
So Oysan shochu in Japan is a combination of brandy and sherry cask, and so they move quite a bit of it after that filtration process, so it's cool. So Kumi's going to join us to just translate a few questions for you guys.
Yeah, can we ask him what he's really excited about, what he's got aging right now?
今寝かせてる樽でなんか一番これが楽しみっていうもの。
楽しみ。結構まあ今だったら、まあバニルスとかモスカテルとかそういうのがどうなるかなっていうのが楽しみですけどね。
Yeah, the muscatel and the banyuls is what he's digging right now. So the sweeter casks. Drew, do you think you're going to be able to sell banyuls cask whiskey?
I can sell all of his whiskey. So yes, the answer to that is yes. You know, obviously the foot in the door with Japanese whiskey is always a pretty easy one, and then once people get excited about the fact that it's a little bit different and unique cast, that it becomes a little bit even more approachable after that. Does anybody else have any questions? I don't want to, that you might be curious about. Elijah, maybe? No? Yeah, put you on the spot.
まだ出荷してないですけど、水ならも楽しみです。
Yeah, he likes the Mizunara quite a bit too. 新しいの重量水なら入ってますか？若いのやつ今水ならの樽はいつも6か7歳ですね。あと、今から新しいのやつ作ってます。水なら入ってます。何本ぐらい？
なので、5。
4？今は6歳から1歳
8
8歳, yeah, so I didn't ask it right. Yeah, so 8-year Mizunara.
So for him, producing soju for Japan and then having it being, having his product that he makes there come to America, like what does that mean to him? Is that something that he's really excited about, or how does he just feel about that in general, I guess?
出ないものをアメリカに出荷するっていうのはどんな気持ちですか？
すみません、もう一回お願いします。
日本で作ってるけど日本で売ってない商品っていうのをアメリカに出荷して売ってるっていうことに対してどんな風に感じてますか？
いや、要は、多分日本だけでは実現できなかったアメリカで、輸出して皆さん飲まれているということはちょっと嬉しいです。はい。
He's very happy that he was able to produce something that American people enjoy but cannot be materialized in Japan. Japan only.
Very cool. And then, you know, with the different experiments that he likes to do, you know, inevitably you have those ones, call him your redheaded stepchild, if you will, that you don't really care for. Has he had any projects that he was just like, I thought this would be good, and then it just wasn't?
これは美味しくなるかなと思って作ったんだけど、実際できてみたらいまいちだったっていうのとかないですか？
まあ、あんまりないですけどね。あんまりないですけどね。基本的にはまあ、最終的には美味しくなるように、まあ、いろんな樽を変えたりしてやっています。はい。
He doesn't have anything that he's unhappy with. He always managed to make it good at the end.
Nice.
Like changing the casks or, you know, changing the formulas, and he always makes it taste good. So he doesn't have anything that he doesn't like.
And like, who are the people that he learned from, and does he look at anybody else distilling today that he kind of pulls inspiration from when it comes to producing his product?
今やってるプロジェクトだけじゃないんだけど、そういうことに関してインスピレーションをもらった人たちとか、そのプロセスを教えてもらった人っていうのはいますか？
インスピレーション的には、まあ、まあ、要はスコットランド行ったときに、まあ、基本的にバーボンで貯蔵してて、まあ、フィニッシュでいろんなものをで使ってるたので、それで結構味わいが変わったので、その、まあ、件に関してはまあ参考にはなってます。
When he went to Scotland, he saw the distilleries that have the casks matured in bourbon casks, but finished in different type of casks. That's something that he wasn't doing before. So that's what he had inspirations from.
Awesome. And is there anything, or what are some of his favorite whiskeys that he doesn't make himself that he enjoys, in his off time?
Oiさんが自分で作ってるウイスキー以外に一番好きなウイスキーとかないですか？これは好きっていう。
一番好き。結構まあ、当たり目よりちょっと、くてっていうか、なんか濃厚な系のウイスキーが好きですね。あっさりめよりは。ちょっと濃いめの、まあ、アイラ系とか、ちょっとビートの効いてるやつとかは好き。
You like something that has richer flavors like Isla or
Kilhoman, yeah.
What's the other one?
Isla.
Heat.
Oh yeah, Pete and Isla. Kilhoman, Janai?
Eh?
Kilhoman, Janai?
Yes. Kilhoman.
So you guys, every time when I go to Japan, I'll bring them a bottle of Kilhoman to enjoy as I take back all of my stuff from there to bring back here.
Nice. Does anybody else have any questions for Chris or Ushi-san for us right now?
これ映んないんだ。
I had a question just regarding the Sakura cask. I wanted to know, like, the cooperage process. Like, what was the inspiration behind selecting those casks?
Oh, did you get that? What was the selection? What was the cooperage process behind? So like why did Ariaki-san start making Sakura barrels? Basically, that's it, right? Like why were Sakura barrels made?
Yeah.
有明産業がなぜ桜の樽を作ろうとしたのかって知ってます？
やっぱりなんか今までは要は、アメリカンウォークとかを、まあ、メインに多分新しい樽を作ってたと思うんですけど、あと輸入の樽 でもなんか、まあ、日本らしい、木材で何か樽を作りたいということを多分作ってると思います。
They used to always use American. They all used to use American oaks and imported materials to make barrels, but they wanted to create something that's from Japan and made in Japan.
Remember, Ariake Sangyo is in Miyazaki Prefecture. It's about an hour away from Oisan. It's distillery, and there's sakura casks are grown in Kumagun, which is right by where Oisan's distillery is. And there's a million of the trees. It's unlike when you think of in America, you think of sakura trees and you think like a row of them that kind of sprout, but they're just it's like weeds. They're everywhere. So they're super available. The oak's super available, and so there's a lot of material to make the cask with. Tim, we will be seeing more Isla Cast. It's being bottled now, so I think it's gonna get on a boat soon.
Nice. Anybody else have any questions, comments, concerns?
Oh shit! I want to give a shout out to Stephen Hirschauer. I hadn't talked to him in a while. I see he's on there. All right, well, guys, thank you so much for your time and spending time with me. Like you guys already know a bunch about whiskey. I recognize so many of the names here. But Oi-san, ijo desu. Arigatou gozaimasu ne.
Bye-bye.
All right. So if no one has anything else, you guys have a good evening. Drew, thank you for doing this as always.
Yeah, of course. You guys, thank you so much. Tune in tomorrow night. We have Jane Campbell from Glass Rev, and then next week we'll be wrapping up our April happy hours, and we'll see what the hell happens for May. But you guys, thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Hey, Drew, I want to say a couple of words, if you don't mind.
Well, I will not close out the window then. Yes, go ahead.
So I know, that shows again how humble Chris is. I mean, that's his show, and he turned it into Japanese whiskeys, Oi-san, his son, his wife. Now, I'm drinking coffee here, and I read, all things are possible to those who believe. And when you read this, you think, or I think, of Chris, because I was lucky enough to kind of watch his evolution of the guy who comes from in the middle of nowhere, Georgia, part-time plumber, part-time musician, part-time. But he was looking for this dream, and he was going to this dream, and that's why he came to a big city like Los Angeles. And I'm going to tell you all the stories that we had while he was tested. He qualified to work for a company that runs by Russians. Like he needed to drink a number of bottles of vodka one day and eat a lot of food and pretend like he's hungry, because we had a few meetings, and every meeting is a huge table full of food, and then in 2 hours another meeting, and etc. And how he was going through this career stairs, if we will. And he was approached by a lot of people from Southern Wine and Spirits and Vision and many others, and he kind of believed in what he was doing. So I want to just say thank you for that, Chris. And also my records on what you were saying in terms of you reading Michael Jackson's book. When you were submitting your resume, you said that you wrote for Michael Jackson. So I just wanted to make sure that one of the stories is right. Also,
that was a Thriller album, is what I contributed to.
I was actually like, I had, when I clicked on the link for it, it was a video where you tell that story. And when you said Michael Jackson originally, I was really hoping it was the pop star. It was still a great story, but it could have been an all-timer. But I mean, I get it.
In between each whiskey, I just read a lyric from one of his albums. That would have been a great whiskey too.
I was so hoping that was it. It was just like, then we went up there and we started dancing, and nobody cared about whiskey anymore. I don't know. That's what I thought the story was.
If it was that Michael Jackson, he would probably dance in front of the 65 people audience. But then another thing, I know that one time I didn't listen to you when you said that bourbon is the next thing, Sam, when we just opened the company. I was ignoring you, so I want to admit that publicly. It was a mistake. And then when you brought this Japanese whiskey project, and I did tell you, Chris, you've done your duties. You proved yourself like a great guy, that trustful and you know, knowledgeable and enthused and pumped with the knowledge and desire to succeed and desire to make your dream through. And I said, you know what, you go and do it, and I'll help you, with all your venues and you know, endeavors. And you said, no, Sam, you don't understand that. I am going with you on this Japanese project. So I remember this, I have it recorded. So all things are possible for those who believe. Thanks, Chris, for being Chris.
Thanks, man. See, you make me sound like I'm not so much of an asshole, but we all know better.
The rest I'll tell you when I'm with you one-on-one.
Well, I'll make sure to have a hidden mic for that conversation. But cheers, everybody. As I said, stay safe. Hopefully to see you again on one of these calls. But thank you all for coming tonight. Tell your friends. You can listen to this on YouTube after if you need a second fix of The Mouth from the South. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Great show, Drew. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thank everyone. Take care. Cheers.